This is coming from Glenn Greenwald, but he's talking about what's going on in Canada, and this is yet another attack on platforms like this one, like Rumble. Uh, it's one of these where it's like you can't see exactly how this will all play out, but these are the opening salvos of basically crushing platforms like Rumble. We already brought to you earlier this week, was it? That the UK is on the cusp of making it impossible for platforms like Rumble, where I have my show, to operate in the UK. So it's quite possible in the next year, Rumble just has to pull out of the UK. And if you're in the UK and you want to keep watching my show, you're going to have to use a VPN or something because it's going to get harder and harder to find my stuff. But anyway, this is talking about Canada. Glenn Greenwald says the Canadian government, armed with one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes, announces that all online streaming services that offer podcasts must formally register with the government to permit regulatory controls. Now, you see how dangerous that is to begin with, because if you have to register with the government to be allowed by the government, and that means the government can deny your registry. You can't just create a website, which is what we've all been relying on through this so-called information revolution that they have tried so hard to crush and minimize throughout it. The reason the internet offered this great chance to share ideas and to share information was that you didn't have to get approval from the government to be online, to have a website, to have a sharing platform, to have a social media platform. You didn't have to get approval. You could just do it. And now many of these platforms, despite that system, have ultimately just caved to the U.S. government and allowed themselves to be heavily censored. YouTube, Google, Facebook. Now, it's the circle jerk. It's who's in control of a circle jerk. Well, I don't know. It goes in a circle. Yes, the U.S. government in many ways tells Facebook and Google what to censor, or in a larger way, how to censor. Weird. It said my mic cut off. Seems to have come back. Anyway, they don't want to risk, getting broken up by the U.S. government. So they, especially Facebook, and YouTube have done terrific jobs of censoring anything that's outside allowable corporate talking points. But anyway, the Canadian government, armed with one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes, announces that online streaming services must get a permit from the government to operate. And here's the news release that Glenn Greenwald shows. It's out of Ottawa, September 29th. The CRTC is advancing its regulatory plan to modernize. That's a great euphemism for heavy censorship. We're going to modernize these things. We're going to bring them into the modern era, which happens to be us telling you what you're allowed to say. Modernize Canada's broadcasting framework and ensure online streaming services make meaningful contributions. Oh, you mean like the kind of contributions that support the fascist government, the quick slide towards fascism, where your parliament is giving standing ovations to Nazis? Is that the kind of thing that you want? Is that a meaningful discussion would be for them to support anything the Canadian government does? And of course, if this were happening in the US, where a company had to get approval by the government to operate, then it'd be very similar. Now, that has happened in the US with television channels, right? They are able to shut down various television channels, and they did shut down my old show, Redacted Tonight. But this is online, so this is the next step. But they say, modernize Canadians' broadcasting and ensure online streaming services make meaningful contributions to Canadian and Indigenous content. And I love throwing Indigenous in there, as if they give a flying fuck about the Indigenous in Canada. Canadian government's done shit for the indigenous. They've been putting oil tar sands through every goddamn area they live, just arresting them, destroying them. The schools where they stole indigenous children and the mass graves were found. I mean, and the last one's closed in like 1979. It's not even that long ago. They're only beginning to talk about it in the past few years, like to actually have some mainstream coverage of it. They don't give a shit about indigenous. Why do they throw indigenous into the statement? Because it's called woke washing, folks. And here's the thing. I'm fine with a lot of woke stuff. In fact, I support a lot of woke stuff. I think every goddamn bathroom should be genderless. Anyone should be. Well, what the fuck? You got to discriminate against people. Who gives a shit? But the who gives a shit thing is what people like to use to ignore it. I actually give a shit. I think that it actually, so in that sense, I mean, there should be genderless bad. We should not discriminate against anyone. But woke washing is another thing. It's using these keywords, these buzzwords. It's the CIA putting out videos of a black lesbian single mother saying, I work at the CIA. It's that kind of shit used to make us think that these platforms are wonderful and nice, or platforms, or these moves by the government, whatever you want to call them, are wonderful and nice, and they're trying to make a better world. No, they're trying to make a world where you will agree with everything that is done by your government. It is full-on indoctrination. And that's why Redacted Tonight was shut down, and that's why the Canadian government is trying to do this. So this is basically Canada's version, and I think it'll get there pretty fast. In a year or two, they could make it possible to shut down Rumble or something else. And Rumble, by the way, is headquartered in Canada. It's a Canadian company. So I don't know whether they'd be able to shut them down entirely, but so this is kind of the Canadian version of what the UK just did, which the UK seems to be moving heavily towards this bill that would make it nearly impossible for Rumble to operate. I'm using Rumble as an example because that's where my stuff is, rumble.com/leecamp, but Rockfin as well, Minds as well, Odyssey maybe, all these platforms that allow you to say what you want as long as it's not calling to harm someone else, etc. They could all be shut down if these governments are trying to make it impossible for them to operate, because they realize they're in a tough situation where they are pro-war, pro-environmental destruction governments, and they do not want us, you, me, and everyone else to be able to rally you and so many others together to fight against this stuff, to fight for sustainability, to fight for peace, to fight for inequality, to fight against inequality, to fight for a much, much, much better world that we are capable of. We live in a post-scarcity world. We live in a world where there is enough food, water, clothing, housing for fucking everyone. But we have economic systems and governmental systems that say, oh, no, we're going to allow for continued aggressive exploitation, both around the world and within your own country. And we want you to endorse that. We want you to sign off on that. We want you to cheer as we create proxy wars or wars around the world. We don't want you telling people it's a bad idea. We don't like that 40% of Americans have now turned against the proxy war in Ukraine. And so they're trying to crush the remaining platforms. And, that's why I had to move to Rumble/leecamp. But it's also why I don't have a TV show anymore. And I hope you will continue to support me. But fight against this. If you're in Canada, fight against this. If you're in the UK, fight against what's going on there. I'm sure the US is not far behind on these type of things, even though the US arguably has that ongoing tradition of free speech that some countries don't. But of course, a lot of caveats on that one. We love a good asterisk. We love a good asterisk. We will kiss your asterisk all day long. Freedom of speech, little asterisk. Unless you say something.